March 1942, Rabaul. An Australian bartender stands behind his bar, watching Japanese officers toast their conquest with whiskey he just poured. But these aren't ordinary drinks. Each glass contains a precisely calculated dose of methanol that will permanently blind them within 72 hours, and over the next 3 months, he'll serve this poison to 40 officers before anyone figures out what's happening. How does a civilian with no military training pull off one of the war's most devastating attacks without firing a single shot? And why did the military try to stop him? The air hung thick and heavy with tropical heat as Joe wiped down the polished mahogany bar one more time. His hands moved slowly, carefully, as Japanese officers filled every table in his establishment. Their voices rose in celebration, loud and confident. They had won. They had taken Rabaul. They had crushed everyone who stood against them. And now they drank in the very bar that Australian soldiers once called home. Joe listened to every word. He watched every face. He had been a bartender for 15 years, and he knew one thing better than anyone. Drunk men talk. Drunk men share secrets. Drunk men trust the person who pours their drinks. Tonight, these officers spoke freely about troop movements, supply lines, and future attacks. They believed Joe was harmless, just a bartender, just a civilian who stayed behind when everyone else ran. But Joe had not stayed behind by accident. He had made a choice, and that choice was about to change everything. The crisis facing Rabaul was complete and total. By March of 1942, over 100,000 Japanese troops occupied the region. They had turned this small tropical town into their main base for the entire South Pacific. From here, they launched attacks on Allied positions. From here, they planned their next conquests. The Japanese controlled every road, every dock, every strategic position. There was no escape. There was no hope of rescue. The Australian military had tried to hold the town when the invasion came. They failed. Most were killed. Some were captured and executed. A few escaped into the jungle only to die from disease or starvation. For the civilians who remained, life became a nightmare. The Japanese command showed no mercy. Any sign of resistance meant death, not just for the person caught, but for 10 others chosen at random. They called it collective punishment. It was designed to make people too afraid to fight back, and it worked. Traditional resistance was impossible. Guerrilla warfare was suicide. The Japanese controlled everything and everyone. Joe stood behind his bar and watched it all happen. He was 52 years old, with gray hair and weathered hands. He had never held a gun in his life. He had no military training, no intelligence background, no special skills except one. He knew how to read people. He knew when a man was lying. He knew when a man was scared. He knew when a man was drunk enough to say things he should keep secret. And most importantly, he knew that these Japanese officers, for all their power and cruelty, had one weakness. They liked to drink. The bar had become the unofficial officers' club. Every night, high-ranking commanders came through his doors. They sat at his tables, they ordered his whiskey, they spoke Japanese among themselves, assuming Joe could not understand. But Joe had picked up enough words over the months, enough to know when they discussed battle plans, enough to know which officers were the cruelest, enough to know that something had to be done. In the early weeks of occupation, Joe had tried to help in conventional ways. He passed information to the few Allied operatives still hiding in the area. He tried to suggest ways to sabotage supplies, but the response was always the same. The intelligence officers told him to stay quiet. They called his ideas amateur thinking. They said civilians should not get involved. They said sabotage would only bring reprisals, and they were right. Every time someone tried to blow up a supply dump or cut communication lines, the Japanese executed dozens of innocent people. The experts insisted that only trained soldiers could fight this war. Bartenders should stay behind bars and keep their heads down. But Joe saw what the experts could not see. He watched these officers every single night. He saw how they relaxed after 3 drinks. He saw how they trusted him because he was just the bartender. He saw an opportunity that no soldier, no spy, no expert had considered. These men were not just enemies, they were customers, and he could serve them anything he wanted. The idea came to him slowly, piece by piece. At first, he thought about simple poison, something fast-acting that would kill quickly. But that would be discovered immediately. The bar would be closed. He would be executed. And worse, it would only take out a few officers before everyone became suspicious. No, he needed something different. Something that would not be connected to him or his bar. Something that would strike hard but leave no obvious trail. Then he remembered methanol, wood alcohol, industrial solvent. He had seen it used for cleaning supplies, for fuel, for a dozen other purposes. It looked like regular alcohol. It smelled similar. It even tasted almost the same if you mixed it right. But it had one crucial difference. Methanol was poison, not fast-acting poison, not the kind that kills in minutes. No, methanol was far more insidious. It took days to show symptoms, and when those symptoms appeared, they were devastating. Blindness, organ failure, death if the dose was high enough. Joe started to calculate. If he could mix methanol into whiskey at just the right ratio, he could serve it without detection. The officers would drink it, feel fine, go back to their posts. Then 2 or 3 days later, they would start to lose their vision. By the time anyone realized what was happening, dozens could be affected. And the best part, nobody would connect it to the bar. Nobody would suspect the harmless old bartender. When Joe first suggested this plan to an Allied operative hiding in the town, the man looked at him like he was insane. Military doctrine did not include poisoning drinks. That was not how wars were fought. Officers fought officers, soldiers fought soldiers, bartenders poured drinks and stayed out of the way. The operative told Joe to forget the idea. Too risky, too unusual, not proper warfare, but Joe could not forget it. Every night he watched more officers celebrate. Every day he heard about more civilians executed. Every week the Japanese grip grew stronger. The conventional methods had failed. The experts had failed. Maybe it was time to try something unconventional. Maybe it was time for the bartender to stop pouring drinks and start fighting back. Maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous weapon in Rabaul was not a gun or a bomb. Maybe it was trust. And so, in late March, Joe made his decision. After closing time, he locked the front door and walked into the back room of his bar, alone with his plan. The most dangerous weapon in Rabaul would not be a gun or a bomb. It would be trust. And he was about to turn that trust into poison. The first challenge was getting methanol without raising suspicion. He could not simply walk into a supply depot and ask for poison. The Japanese watched everything. They controlled all supplies. Any unusual request would be investigated. So Joe had to be clever. He started ordering extra cleaning supplies for the bar, specifically methylated spirits. These spirits contained 95% methanol and were used for cleaning glass and polishing wood. Nobody questioned a bartender ordering cleaning supplies. It was normal. It was expected. The methanol arrived in plain brown bottles, each one containing exactly 1 liter of clear liquid. Joe held the first bottle up to the light. It looked identical to water, identical to vodka, almost identical to any clear spirit. That was both its danger and its power. He opened the cap and smelled it carefully. The scent was sharp, slightly sweet, very close to regular alcohol, but not quite the same. Anyone who knew drinks well might notice the difference. Joe would have to mask it perfectly. He spent 3 nights experimenting with ratios in the back room. He mixed small amounts of methanol with whiskey, testing different proportions. Too much methanol and the taste would be wrong. Too little and it would not have the effect he needed. He researched everything he could find about methanol poisoning from old medical books he kept hidden. The numbers were precise and terrifying. Just 10 milliliters of methanol could cause permanent blindness. 30 milliliters could be fatal. But the key factor was the delayed effect. Unlike regular poisons, methanol took time to work. The human body had to process it first, converting it into toxic compounds that attacked the optic nerve and other organs. This process took between 48 and 72 hours. Joe finally settled on his formula. He would mix 30% methanol with 70% whiskey. A standard drink was about 45 milliliters. That meant each spiked drink would contain roughly 13 to 14 milliliters of pure methanol. Enough to cause serious damage, enough to blind, but not quite enough to kill quickly, which would raise immediate alarms. The whiskey would mask the slightly different taste. The alcohol content would remain strong enough that nobody would question it. And most importantly, the officers would feel fine when they left the bar. They would go back to their quarters, sleep, wake up, and continue their duties for 2 full days before the poison began its work. Joe worked with almost no resources. He had no team, no backup plan, no way to get more supplies if something went wrong. Everything depended on his ability to keep this operation secret while running a busy bar every single night. He created a simple marking system. The spiked bottles would have a tiny scratch on the bottom left corner of the label, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. These bottles stayed on a separate shelf in the back room. Only Joe ever went back there. Only Joe ever touched those bottles. The first test came on March 28th. Joe had selected 3 officers carefully. Captain Yamada, who had personally overseen the execution of 12 Australian prisoners. Lieutenant Sato, who had beaten a civilian woman to death in the street for not bowing quickly enough. And Major Tanaka, who bragged openly about the villages his men had burned. These 3 came to the bar together that night, celebrating a successful raid on an Allied supply cache. They were loud, confident, cruel. They called Joe over and demanded his finest whiskey. Joe's hands did not shake as he reached for the marked bottle. He poured 3 generous glasses, each one containing approximately 45 milliliters of the spiked mixture. He presented the drinks as a gift, a celebration of their victory. The officers thanked him with barely a glance. To them, he was invisible, just part of the furniture, just the man who poured drinks. They raised their glasses and drank deeply, enjoying the smooth burn of what they believed was premium aged whiskey. Joe watched them finish their drinks and order another round. He poured from the regular bottles this time, not wanting to give them a fatal dose. The 3 officers stayed for 2 more hours, drinking, laughing, making plans. Then they left, walking steadily out into the tropical night. Joe cleaned their glasses and waited. Now came the hardest part, the waiting, the uncertainty, the question of whether his calculations were correct. 72 hours later, all three officers reported to the Japanese medical facility with severe vision problems. Captain Yamada was completely blind in both eyes. Lieutenant Sato could see only shadows and light. Major Tanaka had slightly better vision, but still could not read or recognize faces. The Japanese doctors were baffled. They ran tests. They checked for tropical diseases. They examined food supplies, but they found nothing conclusive. The officers were sent to the hospital in Rabaul, then eventually shipped back to Japan for further treatment. None of them ever regained full vision. Joe had proven his method worked, but he could not do this alone forever. He needed help getting more methanol without raising suspicion. That help came from an unexpected source. Chen was a Chinese merchant who ran a general store 3 blocks from the bar. He had lived in Rabaul for 20 years and hated the Japanese occupation as much as anyone. Chen had lost his son in the invasion, shot while trying to defend their home. When Chen noticed Joe ordering unusual amounts of methylated spirits, he asked quiet questions. Joe took an enormous risk and told him the truth. Chen understood immediately. He also understood the danger. If the Japanese caught him helping with sabotage, they would torture him for information, then execute him publicly as a warning to others. But Chen did not hesitate. He had his own supply connections. Other Chinese merchants in the region who imported industrial chemicals. Within a week, Chen had secured 3 more liters of methanol, disguised as cleaning supplies for multiple businesses. The cover story was perfect. Several shops ordering cleaning materials together to save on shipping costs. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual. With Chen's help, Joe expanded his operation in April. He could not spike drinks every night or the pattern would become obvious. Instead, he waited for special occasions, promotion celebrations, victory toasts, farewell parties for officers rotating out. These events provided perfect cover. Officers expected special treatment, premium drinks, generous pours. Joe gave them exactly what they expected, served from the marked bottles that sat waiting in his back room. By the end of April, 23 Japanese officers had reported sudden vision problems. The numbers kept growing, 7 officers in the first week alone, then 6 more, then 10 more. The Japanese medical staff began to panic. They suspected tropical disease. They suspected contaminated food. They suspected everything except the truth. Meanwhile, the remaining officers became desperate for safe alcohol. Ironically, they trusted Joe's bar even more because he was the established supplier. Surely, they reasoned, if the bar's drinks were contaminated, everyone would be sick. But Joe was careful. He only spiked drinks for specific targets on specific nights. Most customers got regular whiskey. Most customers were fine. This randomness made the pattern impossible to detect. The Japanese command faced an impossible situation. Their officers needed to relax, needed to maintain morale, needed somewhere to drink. But something was making them sick. They could not identify the source. They could not stop the mysterious illness. And they could not afford to lose more experienced commanders. Yet they kept Joe's bar open because closing it would hurt morale even more. The officers needed to believe they were safe, that life was normal, that they were in control. Joe served them drinks and watched them fall, one by one, into permanent darkness. By June of 1942, the transformation was complete and undeniable. The Japanese officer corps in Rabaul had been devastated by an invisible enemy they could not fight or even understand. 40 officers now reported vision problems ranging from severe impairment to total blindness. Some could see only vague shapes and shadows. Others saw nothing at all, their world reduced to permanent darkness. The medical facilities overflowed with confused and frightened men who had been healthy and strong just days before their symptoms appeared. The impact on command effectiveness was immediate and measurable. Orders that should have taken hours to process now took days. Communications broke down as officers struggled to read reports or recognize the faces of their subordinates. Junior officers had to read maps aloud to their superiors who could no longer see the battle plans spread before them. Meetings that once ran with military precision now descended into confusion as blind commanders tried to lead men they could not see. The entire command structure of the Japanese South Pacific operations was crumbling from within, and nobody knew why. Before Joe began his operation, the Japanese command staff had functioned at full capacity. They coordinated attacks across multiple islands. They planned offensive operations with ruthless efficiency. They processed intelligence reports, managed supply lines, and directed troop movements with the precision that had made them so dangerous. Officers moved freely between the bar, their quarters, and command headquarters, confident in their absolute control over Rabaul. They believed they were untouchable. They believed they had won. Now everything had changed. The mysterious Rabaul sickness, as they called it, had created a crisis of confidence. Officers who received orders to transfer to Rabaul began requesting reassignments. Nobody wanted to be posted to the place where healthy men went blind for no reason. The Japanese High Command had to rotate experienced officers out of the region and replace them with younger, less experienced men. These replacement officers did not know the local conditions. They did not understand the terrain. They had not built relationships with their troops. Command effectiveness dropped even further. Intelligence gathering by civilians had been nearly impossible before Joe's operation. The Japanese executed anyone caught spying or sabotaging their operations. They had established a brutal system of collective punishment that made traditional resistance suicidal. When 3 civilians tried to blow up a fuel depot in February, the explosion failed to cause serious damage. The Japanese caught 2 of the saboteurs and executed them publicly. Then they chose 15 random civilians from the crowd and executed them as well. The message was clear: resistance would cost innocent lives. 2 other groups had attempted more conventional sabotage during the same period Joe was operating. One team tried to destroy ammunition storage facilities. They managed to set a small fire that was quickly extinguished. The Japanese response was swift and terrible. They executed 23 civilians in reprisal, including children. Another group attempted to poison food supplies going to the Japanese garrison. The plot was discovered before anyone ate the contaminated food. 47 civilians were executed, their bodies left in the street as a warning. Traditional sabotage had killed 0 Japanese soldiers, but resulted in the deaths of 70 civilians. Joe's method was different in every way. He had caused 40 casualties among the Japanese officer corps, 40 men who could no longer effectively lead troops, 40 experienced commanders removed from combat operations, and the Japanese had not connected it to sabotage at all. There had been no reprisals, no executions, no collective punishment. The civilians of Rabaul were safer because Joe's operation looked like a mysterious illness rather than an act of war. The before and after numbers told a stark story. In February, before the operation began, the Japanese command in Rabaul processed an average of 200 orders per day with minimal errors. By June, that number had dropped to fewer than 80 orders per day, with a 30% error rate. Communication delays had increased from hours to days. Officer morale, measured by the Japanese command's own reports that were later captured, had fallen dramatically. Men were afraid. They whispered about curses and tropical diseases. Some believed the island itself was poisoned. Others thought it was biological warfare, though they could not understand how or why. Only officers were affected. The forced rotation of officers created cascading problems throughout the Japanese military structure in the South Pacific. Experienced commanders who knew how to operate in tropical conditions were sent back to Japan for medical treatment. They were replaced by officers fresh from training schools who had never served in the Pacific theater. These new officers made mistakes. They misread situations. They failed to anticipate problems that veterans would have seen immediately. Japanese operations across the region began to suffer as the leadership crisis spread. By May, the Japanese Medical Corps had launched a full investigation. They brought in specialized doctors from Tokyo, men trained in tropical medicine and chemical exposure. These doctors examined every sick officer carefully. They tested blood samples, they analyzed symptoms. They looked for patterns in what the men ate, where they slept, what water they drank. The investigation took weeks and consumed enormous resources. Finally, by early June, one doctor suggested methanol poisoning. The symptoms matched perfectly: the delayed onset, the vision loss, the progression of the illness. It all pointed to industrial alcohol poisoning. But even with this diagnosis, they could not identify the source. The Japanese command tested all food supplies. They tested the water, they tested medical supplies, they examined fuel stores and cleaning supplies. Everything came back clean because Joe had been so careful. The spiked bottles were long gone, emptied and discarded with all the other bar waste. There was no physical evidence, no trail to follow. The doctor's report noted that methanol poisoning was likely, but that the source remained unknown. The investigation had reached a dead end. In early July, the Japanese command made a desperate decision. They banned all locally sourced alcohol. Officers could only drink sake and beer shipped directly from Japan in sealed containers. The bar stayed open, but Joe could no longer serve whiskey or any other spirits. The operation was effectively over, but the damage had already been done. 40 officers were blind or severely impaired. The command structure had been disrupted for months. Experienced leaders had been rotated out. New officers were still struggling to adapt. And most importantly, the legend of the Rabaul sickness had spread throughout the Japanese military. Officers dreaded being posted there. Morale remained low even after the alcohol ban. Joe continued working at the bar, serving beer and sake with the same calm professionalism he had always shown. The Japanese officers still came, still sat at his tables, still spoke freely in front of him. They never suspected the quiet bartender who had served them so faithfully. They never imagined that this harmless civilian had executed one of the most effective sabotage operations of the entire Pacific War. They looked right at him and saw nothing dangerous, just a bartender, just an old man who poured drinks. That blindness, that inability to see the threat standing right in front of them, was perhaps Joe's greatest weapon of all. The Australian intelligence services knew nothing of Joe's operation while it was happening. They learned about it only later, after the war, when captured Japanese medical records revealed the full extent of the Rabaul blindness crisis. Those records showed careful documentation of every case, every symptom, every failed attempt to identify the cause. The Japanese had never suspected sabotage because it seemed impossible. How could a civilian working alone cause such widespread damage? How could someone with no training, no resources, no support, cripple an entire command structure? The experts had not believed it was possible. Joe had proven them wrong. Generate Act 4. Write only Act 4. Word count must be 1,200 words of flowing prose. Format: no bullet points, labels, titles, or section breaks. Structure: faithfully follow the specific scene-by-scene structure provided in the original 4-act outline for the content of Act 4 style. Incorporate all the listed techniques from the original outline: sensory details, precise measurements, contrast, foreshadowing, tension, etc. Language level: use only simple, clear language suitable for a 4th grade reading level. Avoid complex words and sentence structures. Core instruction: the most critical directive is to write Act 4. Weapon 27. Warning. The war continued for 3 more years after Joe's operation ended. Rabaul remained under Japanese control until 1945, though the base never regained its former effectiveness. The mysterious sickness had left a permanent scar on Japanese operations in the region. Even after the alcohol ban, even after new officers arrived, the psychological damage remained. Men feared Rabaul. They whispered about the place where healthy commanders went blind. That fear affected performance in ways that could never be measured, but were nonetheless real. Joe kept working at the bar through 1943. He served beer and sake to officers who never suspected what he had done. He listened to their conversations. He passed along what information he could to the few Allied operatives still operating in the area. But he never attempted another poisoning operation. The risk was too high now that the Japanese suspected methanol. One mistake and they would trace it back to him. One slip and not just he, but dozens of civilians would die in reprisal. So he waited and watched and poured drinks, counting the days until liberation came. In late 1943, the Allied forces began their campaign to retake the Pacific Islands. The Japanese position in Rabaul became increasingly desperate. They started evacuating non-essential personnel. They prepared for a siege that everyone knew was coming. During this chaos, Japanese intelligence officers went through their files and found the medical reports about the Rabaul sickness. Someone made a connection. Someone realized that the bartender had been there the entire time, serving drinks to every officer who later went blind. Joe's name appeared on an execution list. He was to be arrested, interrogated, and killed. Chen heard about the list before the Japanese could act. He came to Joe's small room behind the bar late one night and told him to run. Joe grabbed nothing except the clothes on his back and disappeared into the jungle. For 6 months, he hid in the hills above Rabaul, living on whatever food he could find, or that sympathetic locals could smuggle to him. He was 54 years old, too old for this kind of life, but he survived because the alternative was torture and death. The Japanese searched for him but never found him. By mid-1944, they had bigger problems than one missing bartender. The Allied advance was closing in. Rabaul was finally liberated in 1945. Joe emerged from the jungle thin and exhausted but alive. The Australian military interviewed him along with all the other civilians who had endured the occupation. He told them what he had done. He explained the methanol operation in detail. The officers who interviewed him were skeptical at first. The story seemed impossible, but then they checked the captured Japanese medical records. They found the reports documenting 40 cases of sudden blindness among officers in Rabaul during early 1942. They found the investigation notes about suspected methanol poisoning. They found Joe's name on the execution list. Everything he said was true. The Australian intelligence services faced an unusual problem. Joe had committed what was technically a war crime under international law. The Geneva Conventions prohibited the use of poison in warfare. They prohibited perfidy, which meant gaining trust under false pretenses and then attacking. What Joe had done violated multiple articles of international humanitarian law. The fact that it had been effective did not change the legal reality. If Australia officially recognized his actions, they would be endorsing methods that were internationally banned. Other nations might use Australia's recognition as justification for their own illegal operations. So the decision was made to classify Joe's operation. The files were sealed. He was told not to speak publicly about what he had done. There would be no medal, no official recognition, no public acknowledgement. He was thanked privately and told to go home and resume his life. The government would deny any knowledge of his actions if asked. Joe understood. He had not done it for recognition anyway. He had done it because it needed to be done and nobody else would do it. Joe returned to Australia and opened a small bar in Brisbane. He never married. He had few friends. He lived quietly, serving drinks and keeping his secrets. Occasionally, former intelligence officers would visit him. They would sit at his bar and talk in low voices about the war. They would ask him technical questions about how he had calculated the doses, how he had avoided detection, how he had maintained his cover. Joe answered their questions because he understood they were trying to learn from what he had done, even if they could never officially acknowledge it. The concept of civilian resistance through trusted positions did influence post-war intelligence doctrine, though Joe's specific methods were never officially adopted. Intelligence agencies around the world began to recognize that people in service positions had unique access and opportunities. Bartenders, cooks, cleaners, servants, drivers, all these roles that seemed powerless were actually positions of potential strength. These people were invisible to those in power. They were trusted because they seemed harmless, and that combination of access and trust made them potentially valuable intelligence assets or, in extreme cases, saboteurs. During the Cold War, intelligence services on both sides recruited people in service positions. They did not use poison, as that remained illegal and counterproductive. But they used the same principle Joe had discovered. The powerful often fail to see the people who serve them. Modern intelligence training now includes specific modules on insider threats and the vulnerabilities created by trusted service personnel. Security protocols for high-ranking military and government officials now include careful vetting of anyone who has regular access to them, especially those who handle food and drink. Joe died in 1978 at the age of 78. His obituary mentioned that he had been a bartender in Rabaul during the war and had survived the Japanese occupation. It said nothing about what he had actually done. His operation remained classified for another 12 years. In 1990, the Australian government finally declassified the files related to civilian resistance operations during World War II. Joe's story emerged as one of the most remarkable and unusual cases in the entire Pacific Theater. Historians studied the captured Japanese records and confirmed everything. 40 officers, no civilian reprisals, one bartender working mostly alone. In the 1990s, Joe was posthumously recognized as one of Australia's most effective civilian resistance operators. A small memorial was placed in Rabaul, though it mentions only his courage and sacrifice, not the specific methods he used. His story is now taught in some Australian military history courses as an example of asymmetric warfare and unconventional thinking. But the lessons extend far beyond military applications. Joe's story teaches us that innovation often comes from the margins, from people who are not experts, who are not trained in conventional methods, who see problems from angles that experts never considered. The military planners and intelligence professionals of 1942 could not imagine a bartender as an effective weapon. They were trapped by their training, by their assumptions about how wars should be fought, by their belief that only soldiers could fight and win battles. Joe was not trapped by any of those assumptions. He saw an opportunity where others saw only obstacles. The broader lesson applies to any situation where conventional approaches have failed. Sometimes the solution comes not from doing the same thing better, but from doing something completely different. Sometimes the person who solves the problem is not the expert everyone expects, but the outsider who sees the situation with fresh eyes. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one that appears powerless because nobody is watching, nobody is worried, nobody suspects. In our modern world, we face challenges that seem impossible to solve. Climate change, cybersecurity, pandemic response, economic inequality. The experts work on these problems with sophisticated tools and massive resources. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, and sometimes the solution will come from someone unexpected, someone working in a position that seems irrelevant, someone who sees an angle nobody else considered. The question is whether we will recognize that solution when it appears, or whether we will dismiss it because it comes from the wrong person, from someone who is not supposed to have the answers. Joe the barman never fired a shot, never threw a grenade, never planted a bomb. He just served drinks. But in doing so, he removed 40 enemy officers from combat operations without a single civilian reprisal. Sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from the warriors we expect, but from the quiet ones we overlook. The ones serving the drinks while listening to the secrets. And that is what makes his story not just remarkable, but a timeless lesson. Never underestimate the power of being underestimated.